Hello everybody. Today we are going to continue our series AIOps Explained, the mini-series where we're talking about the release news about the version 4.5. And today we have as a guest speaker David Maier, and he's going to talk to us about batch deletion for actions, so a number of actions to be deleted at once using the API. And we are going to see enhanced HTTP actions. And just to give you a frame, these are all the topics that we are addressing in the release mini-series. And today we are here, so in the last 4 sessions. And this is now a link to the documentation. So if you want to read about it, here's a very good starting point to go into the API that is available and then looking into the capabilities that we have in that environment. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David. Take it away, please.
All right, thanks. Let me share what I have. Okay, so I have 2 topics with me today, both of them revolving around automation actions in AIOps. One of them is batch deletion for actions, the other one being enhanced HTTP action support. I'll go through the simpler one first and the more complex one later. The simpler one is the batch deletion for actions. This sounds like a pretty simple feature. There's some pitfalls though. So just some general overview. This is primarily a UX improvement for the actions table. The use case being if you're working with a lot of actions, a large library, you want to be able to manage them in bulk and delete multiple at the same time, which was previously not possible. The Runbooks UI already supported this, and part of the general theme of the past couple releases in this area has been to align those 2 experiences, so that's why we're also bringing the same feature for actions now. There's a couple edge cases here which makes this a little more complicated, specifically around warnings and errors. For example, predefined actions or Ansible actions cannot be deleted from our experience because they are either hard-coded and referenced in other places, or in the case of Ansible because they're managed in the Ansible automation controller platform, so outside of our direct experience. And then on the other side, we have obviously actions that are being used in other places inside of Runbooks or inside of right-click tools. Both of those are references to a specific action. So whenever you delete that, those things could break. So in those cases, we want to make sure that the user is aware of those warnings and can make a deliberate decision there. Quick mention of the architecture. This is not very complicated if you've ever looked at the RBS and AS architecture for this kind of experience before. Specifically important here, though, is that the batch deletion logic is contained in the UI. So the UI grabs all the information needed for those kinds of warnings and errors, and then performs essentially individual deletions for the action that you select. If you ever have to look at the details here, the important part here is the automation service, which handles the actual deletions. So that's what you'd be looking at for logs or any kind of information there. All right, quick demo. This is going to be a brief one because it's not too complicated. I am on the actions table here in the automations experience, and I have a couple actions selected. The first one is an Ansible action. Then I've got a generic HTTP action, another action of type HTTP, but this one's nested or referenced in a runbook, and then the fourth one, which is a predefined one. And now I can select all of those, and if I now click the delete button up here, you can see there's a new dialog that tells you more about those selections. Some general information about one of them being referenced in a runbook, so you'll want to check that. And then also you have a list, or essentially a table, of all the actions you've selected that tells you what to do with them, if you're allowed to delete them, and why you might not be able to. And for example, for the runbook one, for the third one, there's a link to the runbook that you can open, you can preview it, and you can figure out if this is, for example, still in use, or if you think that's okay and it can break, or if you maybe want to delete that first. The kind of information that you can base your decision off, whether you want to go through with deleting these. So now you can just select the ones you actually want to get rid of, and then you can click delete. That is essentially everything for batch deletion, and I guess I'll move on to the more interesting part. Enhanced HTTP action support is a pretty vague term. What this is primarily focused around is customer requests from people coming from NOI and Web GUI that are used to essentially be able to adjust and access alert data from within automations. So this is targeting to specifically replace WebGUI's SQL tool, which lets you write essentially generic SQL statements that can adjust alert data in place in the database. Similar APIs do already exist in AIOps, but previously they weren't really easily usable in actions, and that's what we're trying to solve here. There's two parts to this. Number one is we want to give users the option to target internal APIs more deliberately. So these APIs already exist and were already publicly documented, but we want to point them out and we want to make it easier to figure out how to exactly address them. So no worrying about which exact domain or internal service they need to use to route to this API. So instead, you just need to figure out which endpoint you need to be using, obviously in conjunction with the documentation that is provided. And then the second part that we've heard from customers is that authentication for these kinds of APIs can be annoying because you either would need to be manually passing through some kind of token or API key, or you'd have to hard code something into the action. And we want to make that a lot easier by instead authenticating these kinds of actions directly as the user that is running the action. So someone's clicking on a button and they are then now the one actually whose authentication information gets passed along, meaning this is implicit behind the scenes and not something that people managing and maintaining these kinds of actions will have to worry about anymore. The architecture here shouldn't be a surprise either. All of this is handled by the automation service, as that's the part or the element that is handling all the executions for these actions. Important here, obviously, the RBAS. Interesting here, maybe to note, is the implicit authentication, which takes the token from the initial request, so from the UI, from the user, and passes that token along to the target API. Of course, that will only work if it's one of those supported internal APIs. We're not going to send that kind of information to any random endpoint. This has to be one of the few that we specifically support for this feature, which are AIOps internal. Okay, for troubleshooting, there's not much details here. Mostly, whenever something goes wrong in this area, the RBAS logs will be relevant and will give you some information about why something might be failing. Yeah, and I think that's all that's really useful there. Obviously, whenever a request comes back with an error, it will also give you some kind of output, so that might also be worth looking at, along with information like the status code of the response. Same thing here. Let's jump over into the product and have a look at what this looks like. So I have a couple examples here that we can use. Worth noting, these example runbooks, or these example actions, sorry, they are also part of the examples that you can load in the product. So they come shipped with the product. So whenever someone wants some inspiration how these kinds of actions can be set up, they can use these example actions for inspiration or as a basis to expand on them later. We can have a quick look at one of them. I'll jump into the editor so you see what that looks like when you set one of these up. So in this case, this is just meant to grab all alerts from the Alerts API and display them essentially in a pretty condensed way. So the interesting part here is in the HTTP request section down here, where you can now select a target API. The custom API here is what you're used to. This is just a generic endpoint that you can target anywhere. You just put in any URL. And now we have two more options, one for the issue resolution API and one for the automation or runbook API, which will pre-fill this base route here that you don't have to worry about. You don't need to know which service this targets internally or how this exactly works. Instead, this is just the base route that you will also find in the documentation, and then you just add your endpoints and the rest of the parameters that you need to the end. You can also find the documentation that's relevant in here. For example, we're now looking at the Alerts API. So in this case, we want to talk to the Issue Resolution API. And you can see, for example, this is the endpoint that we want to talk to. And you can see this part at the start. This is exactly the base route that is already pre-filled by the system. And you just need to know which exact endpoint you want to target. You can see also that there is no authentication information here. So all of that is implicit, as I mentioned before. There's no API key or password or token that you have to pass through here. And that is all done at runtime whenever someone actually runs this runbook, this action. I guess the other thing that I wanted to show is how you can now also integrate this into the alerts table, since the main use case for this is to use it as a contextual menu in here. So I set up a quick action or a quick menu item in here that just modifies a summary of an alert. You can see if I go into the editor here, it has a couple parameters and it's just mapping those from the alert. For example, here it needs an alert ID, and I just grab that from the alert as the alert ID. A couple other things. And now if I go into the alerts, and now I can right click and find that menu item here. And this is just something that would simply update the summary. So I don't know, I'll just add some dummy data here. Obviously, this would be something that highly depends on the use case, and maybe this would update some custom fields, or maybe update some like any number of fields at the same time. But you can see it ran successfully. It updated the summary here, and it essentially did this as my user, since I was the one that started the request, and there is no need for any extra handling of authentication anymore. That is essentially it. There's a couple more details here that you'll find in the documentation, but this is the main use cases and the way it works. And I think that's all for me, and I'll hand it back.
Thank you, David. That was great. Really like the style and the topic, of course. I'm very close to runbook automation as always. And thank you for preparing the stuff. Thank you for listening today. And please see you again when it's time again to see and hear about AIOps explained. Bye.